Hi everybody, it's Terry Ryder from Hotspot, and for this week's version of Hotspot of the Week, I'm going to do something a little bit upside down. And normally with Hotspot of the Week, we seek to identify locations that have the potential to become future hotspots. Tonight we're going to focus on an area which has been a hotspot and is actually starting to wind down. In response to a request from one of our customers who was asking the question, what's actually going on with markets in Hobart and in Tasmania? Right now, Hobart and Tasmania are the national leaders on price growth. They have actually been that way. Certainly Hobart's been the #1 capital city in Australia on price growth for the last 2 years. But all the evidence suggests, including our recent analysis of sales activity in Tasmania, including in the state capital, that the market's past its peak and is starting to wind down. In terms of annual price growth, Tasmania remains the undisputed champion of Australia. 9 out of 10 locations across the state have increased their median prices in the past year, and many of them have recorded double-digit growth in their prices. We've analysed house price data right across the state of Tasmania for all the suburbs of the 2 biggest cities, Hobart and Launceston, and many of the towns across the state as well. We found that 91% of the locations across Tasmania have recorded growth in their median house prices in the past year. Many of them have increased more than 5%, and 35 locations have risen 10% or more. We could only find, in fact, 1 location in the entire state of Tasmania where prices have dropped by more than 5%. That's pretty unusual. You'd find a lot of locations across Sydney and Melbourne, in particular, where prices have decreased more than 5% in the last 12 months. We can only find 1 in all of Tasmania, which is an indication that Tasmania has indeed been a very, very strong market and continues to be. Again, in contradiction to the general rhetoric and theme that we're seeing in media every single day talking about the Australian property market and what's happening to Australian property prices, as they like to term, talking in terms of prices falling across the country. And as I reiterate again and again and again, it simply isn't the case. There are many, many markets. In fact, I would venture to suggest that there are more locations in Australia where prices are rising than falling at the moment. But because of the tendency of media and economists to generalise and talk about Australia as if it's a single market, generally they're talking about the average situation across the capital cities, which is a negative figure in many research companies' estimate because of the weight of Sydney and Melbourne, which are down. But Tasmania is one of those places where prices have been rising strongly and continue to do so. Now, in Hobart, suburbs like Austins Ferry, Chigwell, Risdon Vale and Gagebrook have all increased their median house prices by more than 20%, between 20% and 25% in the last 12 months. These are all mostly locations towards the lower end of the market, the cheaper areas, and that's another indicator that the cycle in Hobart is winding down. The fact that the cheaper areas are now the market leaders on price growth. As is the case with most up cycles, it usually starts at the top end of the market and ripples out. When it gets to the outer ring areas or the cheaper areas, that's an indication that the cycle is coming towards a close, and that's certainly the case right now in Hobart. In Launceston, there's been, in the last 12 months, some very strong price growth in locations like Summerhill up 12%, West Launceston is up 12%, South Launceston is up 16%, Newnham's up 12%, East Launceston up 17%. There are other markets with that level of growth right across the state of Tasmania. Also in the unit markets, 80% of locations that have apartment markets in Tasmania have rising prices in terms of annual growth. In Hobart, suburbs such as Bellerive up 16%, Claremont's up 19%, Glenorchy up 16%, Newtown's up 18%, Westmoon's up 20%. But the star is the highly rated suburb of Lindisfarne, where its median apartment price has risen 32% to $445,000 in the past 12 months. That's based on 45 sales, so it's a reasonable sales sample. I'm not suggesting that property values have increased 32% in the apartment market in Lindisfarne, just that the median price has, and that's probably inflated by the sale of some more top-end product. And we've also seen some pretty substantial rises in median unit prices in some of the suburbs of Launceston as well, particularly Prospect Vale and Newnham, which have risen 25 or 26% in the last 12 months. Now, strong as those results are or appear to be, they are less spectacular than when we did our previous survey 3 months ago. Now, at that time, I wrote, after doing that analysis 3 months ago, in Hobart we can find no suburbs at all with falling prices and none with even minor growth. All the suburbs of Hobart have increased by more than 5% in the last 12 months, and 80% of them are up by at least 10%. Now, that was 3 months ago, so the results that I've just iterated, the most recent survey of what's happening with prices in Hobart is actually, well, strong, and indeed the strongest in the country, not as strong as 3 months ago, which is another indicator that the market has passed its peak and is starting to gradually wind down. But the strongest evidence of that factor comes from our analysis of quarterly sales activity. We now can find very few locations across Tasmania where sales activity is on an upward trend. In most cases, they're what we call plateau markets, which are markets where sales levels have tapered off below their peak and are sort of flattened out on a bit of a plateau below the peak levels. Still solid levels, but not as strong as the peak levels. So we call them plateau markets. Now, in our last, say, 7 or 8 quarterly surveys, the number of plateau markets in Tasmania has risen. It was 17, then it was 30, then it was 39, then 40, then 43, then 46, and in this most recent survey, 54 plateau markets. So you can see the rising pattern of plateau markets, which is another indicator that the market has passed its peak and is starting to taper off and wind down. There are still some growth markets to be found in Hobart, suburbs like Berrydale, Bridgewater, Rokeby, again sort of towards the cheaper end of the market. Howrah is another one. Still have some growth momentum, but the fact that those more outlying and cheaper areas of the capital city, the ones with the strongest sales performance, is another indicator that we're towards the end of the cycle for Hobart. Very similar in Launceston as well. So yeah, it's been not so much a boom as a mini boom, I tend to call it, for Hobart and Tasmania. For the last 2 years, we've seen very good activity, the strongest price growth in the country, but not a boom to equate to what we saw recently in Sydney and Melbourne, where price growth was strong for 4 or 5 years. In Hobart and Tasmania, it's been approximately 2 years, and now it appears that particular party is over, and the price growth numbers are starting to wane, particularly the generalised figure for Hobart as a metropolitan area. So it's been a pretty decent party in Tasmania. It's been driven by big improvements in the state economy, increased level of spending on infrastructure, return to reasonable levels of population growth as a result of all that. Still strong. Tasmania still ranks as the number 4 economy in the country, and the CommSec State of the States report that they publish every quarter usually has Victoria or New South Wales number 1. The ACT is a fixture as number 3. For the last couple of years, Tasmania has been number 4, which ranks it ahead of states like Queensland, Western Australia, South Australia. So it's a pretty high ranking for Tasmania, which traditionally has been 7th or 8th in most economic indicators. So because of that elevation of its economic prospects, Hobart and Tasmania generally have had a mini boom in its property market, but the peak has been passed and it's now winding down. So those looking for growth, I would suggest that Hobart's not the place to look. The best time to buy there was a couple of years ago. I would suggest there are other places to look. Other capital cities, I think, are going to do better in the next couple of years and chief amongst them will be Brisbane, Adelaide, and I believe Canberra as well. Okay, that's hotspotting of the week for this week. Let's do it again soon.